The Fed yesterday removed the word patient from its statement, but my next guest says although this may look like a hawkish move, the Fed has actually become more dovish. Peter Schiff, CEO of Euro-Pacific, joins us now, and I bet you're saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, because I might lose the bet, because they talk about their inflation target, and we don't even get close to it until 2017, meaning why raise interest rates?
Well, they're never going to raise interest rates, at least not until they're forced to. That's what I can't understand, that people haven't figured this out yet, that Yellen has no intention of raising interest rates. I mean, she did mention that it was possible that they could raise rates, but I mean, anything is possible. I mean, an alien invasion is possible, right?
Yes.
But it's not going to happen. And it's not because of inflation. It's because we have a bubble. There is no legitimate recovery. If there was, they would have raised rates years ago. It is a gigantic bubble, and the Fed is afraid to prick it.
So we're going to get straight to it. What are you talking about when it comes to QE4?
Well, you know, first of all, I was listening earlier. You had a guest on that said the Fed is dying to raise rates. And I think that's the last thing the Fed wants to do is raise rates. Of course, the second to last thing they want to do is admit that they can't raise rates. You know, if the Fed wanted to raise rates, they would have done it years ago. You know, and they keep talking about how they're waiting for improvements in the labor market, yet they pretend they're maybe going to raise rates in September. The labor market is not going to get any stronger between now and September. If anything, it might get weaker. I mean, we had a pretty bad private sector ADP payroll number today, just 185,000 jobs. The goods producing sector, the most important sector, particularly weak, just 2,000 manufacturing jobs created. And the labor force participation rate just hit a new low, so the lowest since 1976 or something like that, or 60, I forgot. But it's the lowest of this cycle.
Wow. Okay. So you're saying the Fed doesn't want to raise rates. If that's the case, why do we have commentary like we saw from Dennis Lockhart in the Wall Street Journal? You know, just a couple of days ago, essentially saying, well, you know, getting more hawkish than ever.
Well, you know, they can't admit that they've inflated a gigantic bubble, and it needs a constant supply of air in the form of 0% interest rates, and I think more quantitative easing. They have to pretend that they've created a legitimate recovery that doesn't need this monetary support. You know, if they admitted that they're never going to raise rates, then the dollar would tank, and that would send short-term, long-term interest rates, you know, much higher. And the Fed doesn't want that. So in order to have their cake and eat it too, they keep talking about how they're getting ready to raise rates, but never actually raise them and have to deal with the consequences, which would be, you know, another financial crisis.
So, Peter, what does this mean for the Fed as they're meeting for their two-day meeting on Tuesday? What kind of message are you expecting out of the Fed?
Well, look, they're still going to pretend that there's a rate hike somewhere at the end of this rainbow, but that's not going to happen. I mean, maybe they will acknowledge a softening of the economy, which will be a gross understatement. Look at the horrible data that came out today. And this was April data, so you can't just excuse this and blame it on the weather. But what people have to understand is because of the Fed and their prior policy mistakes of keeping interest rates at zero, of all this quantitative easing, they have screwed up this economy so badly that if the Fed were to raise interest rates at any point, they would precipitate a worse financial crisis than the one they caused in 2008. And so we're not going to get a rate hike no matter what they say. We're going to get QE4, and the next crisis is going to be a dollar crisis.
Let's bring in Peter Schiff of Euro Capital. So, Peter, you know, there are some folks who look at the action that we've seen over the last couple of days, and they say when we get that kind of cascade, that kind of waterfall, that in the past it has sort of signaled that we're pretty close to the end of the correction. What are your thoughts on what we've seen in the market over the last few days?
Well, in the past, it was the Fed that was there to catch the markets and support the markets and talk about more quantitative easing. But right now, the Fed is still pretending that they're getting ready to raise rates, which is really what's behind the stock market sell-off. You know, people want to blame it on China, but it's not about China. You know, the U.S. market was falling before the Chinese slight devaluation. And I wouldn't get too excited about this Turnaround Tuesday rally. They are notoriously suspect. I think there has been a lot of technical damage done. And if the Fed isn't going to come out and come clean about the fact that it's not raising rates, I think this correction will turn into a bear market.
In In terms of what we have looked at, we have seen in the past, I was remembering standing outside of the New York Stock Exchange back in 1997, and, in the afternoon on the day after the Dow fell 500 points, IBM announced a stock buyback. Well, we're not going to get that kind of sort of animal spirits coming from corporations because they're already doing record buybacks. And as you noted, the Fed doesn't really have much dry powder for a surprise rate cut. But if they decide... Go ahead.
Yeah, the surprise that they have is to announce that they're not going to cut rates and that they're going to do QE4, which is what I think they've been planning the entire time. It's just that they can't admit that. They can't acknowledge that we don't have a real recovery, that we just have a gigantic bubble. They can't acknowledge that even a tiny rate hike would prick that bubble. So they have to pretend that what we have is legitimate. And they can't do that unless they're going to pretend they're going to raise.
The question is to hike or not to hike, how to talk to the market. Janet Yellen was speaking yesterday. She made some comments that the market got excited about again with this potential for a December rate hike on the table. I want to take a listen to exactly what she said.
What the committee has been expecting is that the economy will continue to grow at a pace that's sufficient to generate further improvements in the labor market and to return inflation to our 2% target over the medium term. And if the incoming information supports that expectation, then our statement indicates that December would be a live possibility, but importantly, that we've made no decision about it.
Okay, so Janet Yellen obviously saying a lot there. She chooses her words very carefully. She's saying the Fed is still data dependent. She's also saying December is a live possibility, but that no decision has been made at this point, but giving the market the indication that it could happen. Joining me now to talk a little bit more and to react to what Janet Yellen had to say, Peter Schiff from Euro Pacific Capital. Always great to have you on the program. Peter, the way I'm going to phrase this question to you is, I know that you think there's no potential or no real potential for them to actually implement a rate hike. But Janet Yellen is telling the market that there is a possibility of it. Why is she doing that?
Well, she's been saying that all along. And the possibility is no greater now than it was in January.
But this is my question, Peter. If she can't do it, then why say it?
Because you can't admit that you can't do it, because then you're admitting that the whole recovery is a sham, that the policy was a failure. The Fed has to talk about raising rates to pretend the recovery is real, but they can't actually raise them. And you just played her clip. What did Janet Yellen actually say? She said that the chances of a rate hike are very slim. She said we're probably not going to raise rates, but there's a probability that we could. I mean, anything is possible, but she didn't even say probable. She said possible.
Good afternoon. Earlier today, the Federal Open Market Committee decided to raise the target range for the federal funds rate by 1/4 percentage point, bringing it to 1/4 to 1/2%. This action marks the end of an extraordinary 7-year period during which the federal funds rate was held near zero to support the recovery of the economy from the worst financial crisis and recession since the Great Depression. It also recognizes the considerable progress that has been made toward restoring jobs, raising incomes, and easing the economic hardship of millions of Americans. And it reflects the committee's confidence that the economy will continue to strengthen. The economic recovery has clearly come a long way, although it is not yet complete.
Well, I've been saying the same thing for a while, and not that many people have figured this out. I mean, they still believe the Fed.